My name is Seth, and I'm from Chicago. I live in San Francisco now. I've been a Scala contributor for about 10 years, and I've been on the Scala team at Lightbend. So sort of now partly in charge of helping other contributors since 2015. So you are a Scala contributor, or you can be soon if you want to. I will tell you how. Becoming a Scala contributor is not the end of a long journey, but the first step on that journey. This is something small to get started with. If you comment on an existing Scala issue or pull request, if you open an issue or pull request, even if it's a pull request that just fixes a one-letter typo, then you are a Scala contributor. And I will show you my own modest beginnings on this. This was my first bug report from 2008. I noticed a misspelled word in an error message. I opened a ticket to report it. Martin fixed it the same day. That was very exciting. And that was the start for me. Now, that was in 2008. At that time, GitHub had just started. I certainly hadn't heard of it yet. Scala wasn't using it. So it wasn't possible for me to actually fix the error message myself. I would have had to go through a process of signing a paper CLA and trying to convince them to take me on as a committer. But now in 2018, everything is much better. This is much easier. Signing up for a GitHub account is free and only takes a minute or two. Once you have a GitHub account, you can comment on and open issues and pull requests. Your GitHub login is also now the credentials that you can use to participate in the Scala contributors chat room and in the Scala contributors web forum. These are the URLs for that chat room and that forum. The chat room is a Gitter room. That's where Gitter is where almost all Scala chat is these days. You can use it on the web without installing anything, or use their desktop or mobile app. We moved off Google Groups about a year ago and onto this new technology called Discourse. The forums are accessible on the web, or you can also have the messages show up in your email. And again, your GitHub login will work on both of these. So we now have multiple pathways by which you can look for help on open source work. Chat, forum, and GitHub itself. I've arranged these in ascending order of formality. So it's ascending order of how much work they are to use. Chat is by far the easiest. It's super easy to just drop in and ask your question. Writing a forum post is a little harder, and pull request, of course, is quite a bit harder than that. So although it's increasing order of effort on your part, it's also increasing order of likelihood that you will actually get an answer. So you have to expect on chat that the stuff in the chat room is just always flowing by all the time, and you can ask something, and if the right person isn't around, or just if there's too much other stuff happening, it'll get lost. Ask again. If you still don't get an answer, then consider moving to the forum. It's also totally fine to just start on the forum. Some people love chat, and other people just don't. It's totally acceptable to open a pull request even when you still have questions. So even when you know that the pull request is not completely ready for merging, it's totally fine to open it anyway. I mean, you want to give some indication in the request that you know that it needs some work and that you have questions, and then just ask them. Yeah, Dick is saying this is like a discussion around the code, and it's like it's a perfectly focused discussion because the code is right there in the pull request. opening a pull request that is at least halfway there, that has some kind of halfway plausible solution to something that is going to become mergeable, you will almost certainly get help. That's the most surefire way. So those are the communication channels for getting help. But before you even need help, let's talk about where the code is, where the issues are that you might be working on. What's out there and where is it? How is it divided up? I'll be talking mainly about the Scala organization. On GitHub, repositories are grouped by organization. There are multiple organizations that are kind of under the Scala umbrella, Scala org, also Scala Center and LAMP EPFL have important Scala repos. LAMP EPFL, that's for Dottie. LAMP is Martin's research group at the University in Lausanne. So be aware of those other two organizations, but I'm mainly going to talk about the first one today. The main Scala repos to know about are the two website repos. The Scala website is split across these two subdomains, Scala Lang and docs.scala Lang. That split is also reflected in the repos. Scala Lang is generally kind of marketing and getting started content, and more in-depth documentation is usually on the docs site. The repository, Scala/Scala, is where Scala itself lives. So the compiler, the standard library, and the language specification are all there. For historical reasons, there's no issue tracker in Scala/Scala. The bugs in Scala are over in Scala bug instead. Historical reasons, we imported the issues from Jira and the issue numbers overlapped, and so that's how that happened. You may also sometimes see references to issues in this repo Scala dev, which has no code in it, it's just an issue tracker. That's usually just used for the core Scala team to track work in progress, either for the core team or for people that we routinely work with closely. So just be aware that that exists as well. Also under the Scala organization are all of the Scala modules. So these are libraries that are separate from the standard library, but kind of still closely associated with the Scala effort. XML, parser combinators, parallel collections are some of the more popular ones. There's a bunch of other repos under the Scala org, but they're much less often of concern. So now I'll step through how to actually contribute to the repos that I've mentioned. And I'm going to discuss them in increasing order of difficulty, increasing order of how difficult it is to make your first contribution in this area. So I'll start with the Scala websites because that's definitely the easiest to get started with. Even if you are new to Scala, if you're still learning it, or if you're new to Git, new to GitHub, or new to open source in general, those are all good reasons to start here. Although anyone at all of any experience level is welcome to help out with the website. There's kind of three different kinds of work that's needed on the websites. If you have some experience with web technology, so if you know HTML, CSS, JavaScript stuff, that is valuable and needed. There aren't many of us at Light Bend or the Scala Center who have those skills. If you look in the issue tracker, you'll see that some of the issues are technical, or about design and layout stuff where web skills are relevant. All of the content on the websites needs work. So if you have any writing or editing skills or spelling skills, that's all good. And we're very interested in offering as much of the Scala documentation as we can in as many languages as we can. But we rely on volunteer translators for that. The number one thing that we most want to offer in as many languages as we can is the tour of Scala. That's like a feature by feature kind of inventory of Scala's major features. So it's something that someone can read straight through to learn about the entire language, or just look at the page for a particular feature if they want to find out what that feature is. We have a lot of existing translations for that, most of which are out of date. So if there's already translation, it would be great to have help bringing it up to date with the current English version. New translations are also extremely welcome. The process for contributing to the website, if you're making a very small change, and by small I mean confined to a single file, and if your change is simple enough that you're not worried about breaking something, you're not worried that it will be rendered wrong, then you can make your edit purely in the GitHub web UI. You don't need any kind of Git client or Git command line stuff. If your change involves multiple files, or if it's something a bit trickier that you want to see how it's going to look before it goes live, then these are the steps for previewing your changes. These same commands are also in the README file in both of the website repos. The steps are exactly the same regardless of which of the two repos that you're in. So all you're doing is cloning the repo. The websites use a static site generator called Jekyll that's made by GitHub and that I believe is still quite popular. It's based on Ruby. I certainly don't know Ruby or Ruby tooling, but we've tried to make it pretty turnkey so that just type in bundle install. You do need a Ruby installation before you can use bundle at all, so that you might need Ruby help with that. But once you have Ruby and bundler, then just these two commands should be enough to build the site and preview your changes. The --watch makes it so that it monitors the file system to see when you change a file. So as soon as you edit something, hit save, you'll see in the terminal window that it's regenerating the site, and you'll be able to open up your web browser and see what you did before you send it in. So that's the full process for contributing to the website. I mentioned the issue tracker. Oh, pardon me. We have made some effort to label issues that are appropriate for newcomers with this label good first issue. That's increasingly becoming a standard on GitHub, that projects that are especially eager to attract contributors and be welcoming to contributors will use this label to mark good getting started issues. So we've done that here, and you'll also see this probably not in every repo in the Scala org, but in many of them. If you're interested in contributing to one of the Scala modules, I'm only going to do one slide on this because the modules are actually not terribly special. So most of what I would have to say about this really applies to any Scala open source project. A great thing about module work is that you don't have to wait as long for your changes to ship as you do when you're working on Scala itself. So it varies from module to module, who's doing the maintenance, whether it's mostly Lightbend or whether it's mostly community people or somebody else. And the release schedules do vary, but in principle, there's no reason why changes can't be shipped as soon as they're ready. The tools that we use on the modules are the standard ones in the open source world. Build is with SBT. Tests are usually either Scala test or Scala check, or perhaps some of both. Scala check is, if you don't know it, is especially worth learning. It's a generative testing tool that generates random test data that your code has to pass, instead of having to write each test individually. That's very cool. And the module repos all have automated PR validation through Travis CI. The advent of Travis CI in recent years has really kind of revolutionized open source work. Like, there was always this problems before where people were submitting things that they thought passed the tests, but they actually didn't. Travis CI takes care of that. You send the pull request, it runs the tests for you, and then it gives a result status and log details right there on the PR. It's great. Let's move on now to the main Scala repository. The main Scala repository contains the Scala language specification. It contains all of the API doc for the standard library. It contains the Scala code for the standard library itself. And it contains the Scala compiler. The Scala compiler is bootstrapped. It's written in itself, so it's a Scala program that compiles other Scala programs. So it's all Scala. Here's some statistics on activity in the Scala repo last month. We merged 170 pull requests from 33 different people. And the main thing I want to emphasize about this is that most of these people are actually outside contributors. So there's only a few of us on the core team. Most of the work is actually being done by you. Not only in number of people, but also in number of commits. So that means that when you're working on when you submit a pull request, when you're looking for help, there's lots of people out there who are going to be able to help and be able to become your colleagues and collaborators. It's somewhat rare, I think, that someone wants to work on the language spec, but it does happen. There's a category of issues in the Scala bug tracker called spec. The help with the spec that we need most is in merging accepted Scala improvement process proposals into the spec. So once the SIP committee accepts a language addition to Scala, in theory, the proposal that was approved then becomes part of the spec. In practice, that hasn't been happening. We'd really love it. Someone sent one in last week for string interpolation to get that in. That was awesome. We'd love to have help with this. The tool set for the spec is the same as for the sites. It's Markdown and Jekyll. For everything but the spec, the contributing process is covered in the contributor docs, which for no good reason are split across these two files at the root of the repo. You'll want to at least skim through both. There's a tension between providing contributors with like tons of information and just overwhelming people with reading material. You really don't need to read everything in all these files before sending your pull request. But if you're more cautious and like to prepare, you might want to read through this stuff. The API doc is an easy area of contribution. In order to work on this, you basically only need to know enough Scala, and you need to know Scala doc markup. Scala doc markup is its own thing. Unfortunately, this is historical. It's not the same as Java doc because it's better and more powerful, but it's not Markdown just because it's actually older than Markdown. In practice, I think this is really not so much of a barrier for contributors. Like you just open a file up and look at what the other Scala doc comments look like and just copy it. I think it rarely trips people up. In order to build the Scala doc and preview your changes, you'll need to use SPT, but it's only very light usage. So these are the complete steps for previewing changes. You need to clone the repo, edit the Scala source file that contains the API doc that you're changing, run SPT, leave it running, and then run library/doc. So library is one of the sub-projects in our SPT build, and doc is the standard SPT command for building Scala doc. So this is the same stuff you would do in almost any repo where you were doing this. It will take a few minutes to build Scala. The Scala doc tool is part of the compiler, so it has to build the compiler too. The second time you run it will be fast, and then you can review the resulting HTML files in your browser. Those source files that have the API doc are, of course, the same source files that contain the Scala code for the Scala standard library. If you're interested in contributing to the Scala standard library, you need to know how to run tests using SPT. In general, this is usually the same as running tests in any Scala project. If you're writing new tests for the standard library, we recommend that you use either JUnit or Scala check. JUnit, so JUnit, it's a Java library, but you're using it from Scala. The tests are in Scala regardless. You may also see existing tests that use a testing framework called partest. Standard library tests if it uses partest, that's purely for historical reasons. But just to be aware that you may see that. If the change you're making to the library has performance implications, which is especially common if you're making changes to the collections, then in your pull request you may be asked to provide benchmark data, like proving that your change either doesn't cause a performance regression or that it actually achieves the speed up that you're claiming. There's a separate README in this directory test/benchmarks that has some JMH-based benchmarking technology. Not every pull request will need that, but some will. Now, suppose you are interested in hacking on the compiler itself. And this comes last as needing the most study and preparation. If you're doing compiler work, then partest is almost certainly going to be something you'll need to learn the basics of. We have some compiler tests that are in JUnit, but really the overwhelming majority use partest. The good news is that the learning curve on partest, did I say partest is unique to this repo? So it has no other users other than other Scala implementers, such as Scala.js. The learning curve is pretty small. You can, if you have a Scala file that you want to just verify that it compiles, put that Scala file in the pause directory. If you have a file that you want to be sure doesn't compile, then you put it in the neg directory. If you want to actually run some code and make sure that it does the right thing, then write a .scala file that prints some things to standard output. Include alongside the .scala file in the run directory, include a .check file that's just a plain text file showing the output you're expecting. And that's basically all there is to it. I mean, partest does other stuff, but that's like the stuff that you would actually be using 80 or 90% of the time. The usual workflow for doing compiler work is you probably aren't going to run the entire test suite yourself on your laptop. It takes about half an hour and will make your laptop very hot. So the usual workflow is to learn how SBT allows you to run only particular tests. And then just take advantage of that to run the tests on your laptop that are either the tests that you just wrote or the tests that you know are relevant to the changes you're making. Both SBT and partest allow you to select tests by substring. So like if you're working on bug 8891, then often there'll be a file with 8891 in the name. Once your code is passing the test that you've run locally, then it's totally fine to open a pull request, even though you don't know whether the whole suite passed. Just open a pull request and let Travis run the test for you. It currently takes about 30 minutes. We're very proud for having recently reduced that to 30 from more like 80. If you want to learn about compiler hacking, unfortunately, we don't have a centralized location for documentation for this. So I've put together a short series of slides where I'm going to recommend, my own opinion anyway of the crucial learning resources that are good starting points. Jason Zog, my colleague on the Scala team, gave a talk a couple years ago in Australia called Scala C Survival Guide. It's about 75 minutes. It's a super engaging talk. So it's not a lecture talk, it's all live coding, and it's all done in the REPL. So it's not so much 75 minutes of here is the architecture of the compiler. It's 75 minutes of here are the tools that you can use in the REPL to interactively explore for yourself how the compiler works, what's in there, what it does. It's a really engaging talk with a good teaching approach, I think. The other main resource that I would suggest that everyone look at is a document called Scala Hacker Guide, originally written by Eugene Bermacro. The overlap with JSON stuff is not that much, so it takes a different approach. It says, well, suppose you wanted to make this change to the Scala compiler. I will walk you through the entire process from beginning to end of everything that you will run into, everything that you will need to do all the way along the way, including testing. It's a nice, long, detailed walkthrough. Some of the details in this guide are now a bit out of date, so it's possible that you will run into minor trouble. Most of it is still applicable. We would love to get pull requests actually fixing some of the out-of-date details. Like almost any compiler, the Scala compiler works as a series of phases. So your source code comes in one end, it passes through a series of compiler phases and gets gradually transformed into something that looks less and less like Scala, more and more like Java, and then eventually at the end, Java bytecode. You can take any small Scala program and run it through Scala C with this flag -x print all. And what that does is after each phase of the compiler runs, it prints out the current state of the code in Scala-like syntax, right? So you, not some AST gobbledygook, but it still looks like the original code. This is super valuable for understanding what are the compiler phases, what do they do, and because having to grasp with that is a really basic part of doing compiler work. It's just like, well, where would this change even happen? If this bug is occurring, can I, often from the nature of the bug, you can guess like, oh, that's happening in typer phase, or oh, that's a back-end problem that's happening in JVM phase. It's also just fascinating, I think. Like, even if you don't end up doing any compiler hacking, just getting this window into the internal workings of the compiler on any piece of code that you hand it is a really great way to improve your understanding of Scala. We recommend IntelliJ for compiler hacking. This is not the kind of, oh, you're new, you probably want to use an IDE type recommendation. The hardest core compiler hackers at Lightbend, like Adrian and Jason and Lucas, actually use IntelliJ all day to do this, and they swear by it. Yeah, some of us use Emacs. IntelliJ's IDE features are extremely useful for working in a large, unfamiliar, complex code base like this. The IntelliJ debugger is also extremely valuable, but not only for actual debugging, but also just as an educational tool when you're still learning how things work. Either build Scala in IntelliJ and enable the debugger, or you can also just tell the IntelliJ the debugger to attach to any running JVM that you started with the special flags that enable the JVM debugger interface. And so then you can step through anything. Other good educational activities for improving your compiler skills. Working on errors and warnings is a great way to get started. Anything that you do or anything that you've done in the past that involved the Scala Reflection API is directly relevant to compiler work. The same is true of anything you do or have done with macros or with compiler plugins. Reflection API, macros, compiler plugins, they all involve direct manipulation of compiler internals. So there really is no firm distinction between these three things and compiler hacking. If you're interested in compiler plugins in particular, a few months ago at the Northeast Scala Symposium, I gave a talk called Compiler Plugins 101. The first half of that talk is like, what is a compiler plugin? What powers do they have? Why might I want or not want to write one? The second half actually gets you started on writing one, including a sample skeleton project that you can use as a starting point. So those are all possible learning paths for starting to work on your first compiler bug or improvement. So far I've been talking exclusively about Scala 2. You may be wondering, well, what about Scala 3? I'll start by answering that question by emphasizing that Scala 2 and Scala 3 are not divergent projects. Once we finish up with Scala 2.13 and ship it later this year, the theme of the Scala 2.14 release is going to be alignment with Dotty, preparation for Scala 3. Scala 2.14 and Scala 3 will share the same standard library, the same compiler backend, the same library ecosystem, thanks to Tasty, is going to make that possible for Scala 3 to use Scala 2 compiled jars that have Tasty in them. There's a lot of shared stuff. So if you want to help make Scala 3 happen, working on Scala 2 now is actually working in that direction. But my intent there by saying that is certainly not to discourage anyone who wants to from actually jumping in and starting to work on Dotty now, today. They've been open to outside contributors now for quite some time. It isn't something that I've been involved with personally myself, so I can't go into details about it, but I can at least point you to the main places that you will go. So the Dotty compiler is in this repo under lamp EPFL. The Dotty team has their tradition for having design discussions is to do it all on GitHub. usually, rather than to use discourse. I don't know if they plan to change at some point or just stay on GitHub. But anyway, look in the issue tracker for Dottie, and you will see not only bugs and people tinkering with code, but also like really serious design discussions about the future of the language. There's a Dottie chat room on Gitter. Not all of the core Dottie team members hang out there, but several of them do, and it's a pretty active and interesting place. When I talk to people who are interested in getting involved with Scala open source, this is by far the most frequently asked question is, well, what should I work on? I guess some people know, but most people, I talk to a lot of people who are just like, I want to help, I want to get involved, I have no idea what to do. I'll answer this question in two different ways. If you really just want someone to suggest something specific, I'm going to do that. I'll give you a list of like my own personal pet suggestions for getting started projects. And then I'll also go on and give some general advice on answering this question for yourself. So my specific suggestions are, I mentioned this already, we would love help improving the tour of Scala. It's like the single most important resource on the websites. And it's very accessible to newcomers to contribute. If you're new to the language and actually using the tour to help you learn, then you're in exactly the right mindset to notice where the text is unclear, where things are wrong. Those of us who've been doing Scala for too many years have lost that perspective. So we'd love to have your help on this while it's still fresh. We would love to have help triaging and responding to bug reports in Scala Bug. We have way too many old, stale tickets that we don't, that may not even be clearly actionable or may no longer be reproducible in current versions of Scala. We'd love to have help with that backlog. We also have lots of new tickets coming in all the time, more than the core team can respond to ourselves. Evaluating and improving bug reports is something that you can do even right at the start. There's no wall between whether you're allowed to do a bug triage or not. We'd love to have help with that. We also help identifying good first issues. So we do have, I think, about 70 or 80 good first issues in the Scala repo identified, but there are surely more. It just needs people to notice them. The same is true of pull request review, that the process of pull requests getting approved and merged or rejected is not just something that happens between like one contributor and one maintainer from the core team. This is a collective process where everyone who's interested, everyone who's involved, even if you haven't started sending your own pull requests, everyone is welcome and encouraged to participate in this. Pull request review is not just about, yes, this is good to go, or no, we're rejecting this. It's about taking something that's a first version and improving it into a final version. Even if you don't understand the details of the code, so even if you can't say, oh, I spotted a bug there, you can consider other issues about the pull request. Is the change well tested? Does it include appropriate documentation changes? Is the code clear? Is there a possible performance issue that the contributor might not have considered? And is the change even justified? Is this desirable to have at all? Input on all of these questions, as well as more kind of standard code review, is welcome from everyone who's interested. Out in the broader ecosystem, The ecosystem, I think, is roughly half migrated from SBT 013 to SBT 1. If you use SBT, if you know your way around SBT at least fairly well, there are lots of open source Scala projects that would love to have someone help them upgrade their builds. Also out in the ecosystem, happening right now, this is very timely because Scala 2.13 M4 was just released a few weeks ago. M4 was the first Scala milestone to include the new collections API in Scala 2.13. So this is a larger than usual change to the Scala standard library, and so the whole ecosystem is kind of scrambling right now to adapt their code to this and to get their libraries published for M4. Basically, every library needs help with this right now. You will, if you go and try to help your favorite library with this upgrade, you may discover that they're blocked because not all of their dependencies have published yet. No one can publish for M4 until all of their dependencies have first published. So if you go to help your favorite library, look to see if they have an issue. You know, has anyone even asked them to publish for M4? If there is no such issue, open one. And then look and see, like, you know, open the build, change the Scala version to M4, and see whether the dependencies are available. You may need to bump version numbers. There's a list of published libraries for M4 on the Scala site, but also in Maven Central and in Scaladex are all possible ways to search. And if you identify a library that's blocking your favorite from upgrading, then go upstream, go to that library's repo, see if they have an issue for publishing for M4. If they don't, open one, and so forth. This process of getting the ecosystem onto Scala 2.13 is an extremely distributed process. There's no limit to how many people could be helping with this. And closely related, even if you just have personal projects in Scala, we'd love it for people to be trying out the 2.13 collections, reporting issues that you find. I would say that so far the reports are that the M4 collections are actually in surprisingly good shape. So most people are able to get their projects working and are having few problems. Problems that have been reported are usually small. However, there are quite a few of them, and those issues, either bugs that have been, regressions that have been reported, or the sort of remaining bits of work in the bug tracker on the collections, those are usually really good getting started issues. The collections are somewhat complicated, but really not that complicated. Most of the issues have straightforward fixes. Okay, general thoughts on deciding what to work on. And I see I'm running a little low on time, so I may have to go through these last few slides rather quickly. Start small, scratch your own itch, work on something that you care about, that you use. If no ideas come to mind, you can hang out on Gitter or Stack Overflow, see what questions people are asking. Any question that someone has is almost always either, at minimum, an opportunity to improve documentation, and maybe a bug or an opportunity for an improvement to the code. Choose a repo that corresponds to your own personal tolerance for delayed gratification. Working on the Scala website is great because when your PR is merged, it's live in 5 minutes. If you work on Scala, your change might not come out in a final release version of Scala until like 1.5 years later. And if your company is behind on Scala versions, it could be like 3 years before you and your coworkers actually get to use your change. Some people are so excited about getting a change into Scala that they're fine with that. Other people are just like, no. If you don't know which project to work on, pick the one that wants you most. Pick the one that's recruiting you, that's being friendly to you. Look for projects that have good first issue labels. See if they have a contributor's guide. Ask a couple questions in chat and just see whether you get a friendly and prompt response or whether it's just like crickets. And if it's crickets, pick something else. Once you've picked something to work on, staying motivated can be difficult. I'll have to cut this very short and just say that the two most important things I want to say. One is understand that open source work is slow. The main, you're going to get stuck, and then you're going to have to, you'll be waiting hours or days for help, because a lot of this is stuff that people are doing on evenings and weekends. And the main fix for this is don't wait for your first pull request to get merged before you do a second one. As soon as the first one gets stuck, start a new one. Have lots of pull requests going, perhaps in multiple projects, so that you always have something to work on. Second major piece of advice, find collaborators. And consider finding them in person. Consider working with a coworker, with someone that you meet at a local Scala meetup, or consider going to a Scala open source spree. This picture is from the spree that was held here yesterday in New York. Daria from the Scala Center has been organizing these increasingly often. Open source project maintainers come, they prepare lists of issues for the attendees to work on. The goal is that those issues are easy enough so that someone who participates can get a pull request merged in one day. If you can't attend in person, still look at the agenda for the spree, see what maintainers were there. They're really demonstrating that they're there for contributors. Look at the list of issues that they posted, and you can work on those issues at home if no one did it in person at the spree. Thank you. Can I take questions?
So if the documentation is in a different repository than the code, so if I'm making a pull request to the code, I have to make another pull request in another repository for the documentation. How do they connect to each other?
So the question is, what if my change involves multiple repositories, which can happen if the documentation is in a separate repo from the code? There really isn't a good story for this on GitHub. So you basically just have to open two separate pull requests and make crosslinks. We try to keep things in the same repo. I mean, most Scala changes, in general, in the repos that I talked about, this normally doesn't happen because the standard library, the compiler, the language specification, and the Scala doc are all in the same repo. So you won't run into this too much. We're out of time? OK. Thank you.